Då gör vi som sagt så en liten rokad i en programändring eftersom vi väntar på Internetstiftelsens chef Ann-Marie Eklund Lövinder att hon ska komma med tåg. Mer information kommer om detta senare. Men vi är väldigt glada att professor Andreas Bellman var på plats här i Malmö redan från morgonen så att han skulle ha talat klockan 13.30. Så att nästa programpunkt är konsten att förebygga våldsbejakande radikalism och på plats har vi professor Dr. Andreas Bellman från Friedrich Schiller universitet. Ge honom en varm applåd. The stage is yours.
Yeah, good morning everybody. I understand nothing, but it sounds really good. I'm sorry. Thank you for this introduction. I'm sorry that I can't talk to you in your home language. My Swedish, believe me, is very, very weak, and this is already an exaggeration. So you are in the position that you have the pleasure to enjoy my poor English. I'm sorry for this. So I was asked to talk about the state of the art in research on radicalization and extremism, and I'm very happy to can present all the things we have done in the last 10 years, mainly summarizing the research and building up a new developmental theory on radicalization, which is the basis of new prevention measures. Before I start, let me say 3 notions. The first is I will not give you an introduction in some empirical studies, but more an overview what have been done in radicalization research from all over the different disciplines which are involved in these kind of research. So it's not a single prevention study or something like this, but an overview what have been done in radicalization research. The second one is I will talk about psychosocial programs and educational interventions and not on, let me say, political or legal prevention measures. They also exist, or on policing or work of the security services, but mainly on psychosocial prevention models. And the last one is I will take an developmental perspective. That means nobody is born as an extremist. And from birth to the situation where somebody is radical or make an extremist behavior, there must happen something. And I would like to describe what happens. And nobody get spontaneously an extremist. There are pathways, developmental pathways, and I would like to talk about this. And this is a basis for new initiatives for preventing radicalization and extremism. So let's see what I want to talk about. I will start with some definitions that's crucial in the understanding what radicalization and extremism means, and we will see there are quite difficult problems to solve in the definition of extremism. And I will talk a little bit about existing radicalization theories. Maybe some of you have some notion about these theories. Then I will present a social developmental framework of radicalization and extremism, and then I will talk about what we now have for programs and interventions to prevent young people from this developmental pathway, and finally some conclusions. So let me start with the definition and existing radicalization theories. First, the definition of radicalization and extremism. I was really surprised when I started with my researchers, or with our researchers at our team, that there were several definitions in the political science, in the social science, in psychology, and not a clear understanding what radicalization and extremism means. So if you want to prevent something, you have to know what you want to prevent. So it's very crucial or necessary that you have a definition of what you want to prevent. So we look at every definition and look for some common features and bring in our own ideas about what radicalization and extremism means. So radicalization describes the process of getting extreme in attitudes and behavior. Extremism is usually viewed as an endpoint of this development. So a lot of definitions are clear in this radicalization area. But this definition points to the definition of extremism. So what do we think is extremism? And if we have the time to ask everybody here in the room what he or she is thinking about extremism, I will predict that we have 50 or 60 different definitions on what is extremism. So we put all together and could say that political or religious or some other kind of extremism is a significant deviation in attitudes and behavior from existing or, and we will see this is one of the main problems, or certain norms and values within a given society or social system, and that they usually aims to replace these values. For example, human rights, democracy, or rule of law, using mostly violent, but not necessarily violent, and illegal means. So this is let me say, the summary of all extremism definitions. I will point to two definitional and conceptual problems. The first question is, should we extremism define as deviation from existing norms and values within a social system, or from certain norms and values in the system? We argue for certain norms. Otherwise, if you depended on the existing norms within a society, everybody, like Mr. Putin, Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Trump, can define their own extremism. And I would like to say that people who fight against dictatorships are not extremists in the sense, although they are against the values and this special system. But they are against certain norms and values. They are against human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. These are the three main things. So, resistance fighters against dictatorships are not extremists in our sense. The extremists are the dictators and not the people who fight against this. So, our answer is we should define extremism with respect to some certain norms, like human rights, democracy, and rule of law. This is also important for the differentiation between radicalization and extremism, and on the other side, desired political engagement or activism or justified political resistance. The second question is much more difficult. To what extent should someone deviate from these norms and values? In other words, when starts radicalization and when ends the freedom of opinion? If someone in the room say, I'm against that refugees come to Sweden or Germany, doesn't matter, is this an extremist attitude? Yes or no? I mean, we all agree if somebody make a terrorist attack, that is extremism. But is it an extremism if somebody said, no, refugees have to come to Sweden or Germany? I'm not for that opinion, understand me correctly, but do we think that we should prevent this attitude, or is it within the freedom of opinion in democratic states? It's a very difficult question, and I have at the moment no answer on it. It needs discussion in the society on what should we label as extremism or radical attitude or behavior, and what should we prevent or people prevent from this. Okay. A short overview on radicalization theories. You're maybe familiar with some of these or all of these. I selected 4 prominent theories or recent theories and how they explain that radicalization happens. It's important for prevention, of course, because if we have a good theory on radicalization, we also have very good ideas on what we should prevent or work on. That's the idea. And we have in the political and social science a lot of authors who say social disintegration is the main factor for radicalization, or relative deprivation, somebody called this, or political dissatisfaction. We are not happy with the politicians. And if we want to change it, we can't. So that's the way into radicalization and extremism. We can discuss about this. A lot of social science and political authors are convinced that this is the main reason for radicalization. We have some developmental models already in the 2005 from Moghadam. He calls this model staircase to terrorism. And this is a stage model, a staircase model of getting a terrorist. And it started with perception of injustice within some social system in society. There is some form of injustice. They want to compensate and work against these injustice, but this do not work. So then the next stage or the next 2 stages are that they get involved in deviant activities. And even if that don't work, they get at the end a terrorist and do terrorist attacks. That is the stage model. Very simple explained at the moment, but there are more stages, about 6 to 8 stages. But that is the idea, that it becomes worse and worse. A new psychological model comes from Kruglanski and colleagues, and they explain extremist behavior as an indicator for an unfulfilled need to belong. These people have, let me say in psychological words, identity problems. They have some problems with their self-esteem, and the reason for getting extreme is to get some form of need from other people. That's the idea of Kruglanski, very simple psychological model. And finally, the multiple pathway model from Macaulay and Moskalenko. And these authors stated that it's not only one way into extremism and radicalization, but several ways for people to get involved in radicalization and extremism. And they have they analyzed all extremist biographies in the 20th century, about 100 biographies of people who are involved in terrorist acts, and they see 12 different pathways, and they ordered this to an individual pathway, to a social group pathway, and to a mass radicalization pathway. So this is the first model who say there are several ways to get involved in radicalization. However, despite that these models are quite complex, at least the last one, we have found some shortcomings on this. I mean, all these theories are on adult person, and nobody explains how was the childhood and adolescent. So in psychological word, we have no explicit ontogenetic developmental foundation. Is it, do you assume that people get radicalized in adulthood? Or could we see some precursors, some former expectations when people get radicalized or extremist? We say yes, and I will explain our developmental model. That's the same situation, for example, in crime, in explaining violent crimes, not radicalization. We have really a large and huge progress in our understanding how people get involved in criminal careers in the last 30 years. And let me say, one point is that we now know all the pathways from early childhood to adulthood, how people get involved in criminal careers. And the same, we want to transfer this idea on radicalization and extremism. And as we know from biographical analyses that 90% of all extremists all over the world get radicalized at the late adolescence and early adulthood. So the risk to get a radical person in later adulthood is really very, very low. Let me say 1 of 1,000 cases started later. And even then you can ask, is there something in the development who takes these people to get radicalized with 50 or 60 years? So the main risk age is the late adolescence and early adulthood. So a developmental theory is necessary as a basis also for prevention. And I would like to present what we have done in integrating the information from all social sciences to get a first sketch of a developmental theory for radicalization. You can see here, it's not an idea we do at one evening with the wine and a beer. It's a process of 3 or 4 years integrating all these information sources for making such a developmental theory, starting with general theories of behavior problems and crimes like the general threat theory or problem behavior theory, specific radicalization theories, basic motivational and social psychological theories, for example, on needs or for prejudice or for social identity, and also special developmental theories, how prejudice, for example, developed in the course of childhood and adolescence. And finally, of course, research on risk and also protective factors from biographical, cross-sectional, and sometimes also from longitudinal research. Longitudinal means that you look at a group of people every year, let me say, and look how they develop. And if you have a good longitudinal study over 20 years, let me say you start with newborns and ended up with 20 years, you need 20 years for this study, of course, but for the making of a good developmental theory is absolutely necessary. And we have a very, very few longitudinal studies who give some good indications for our developmental theory. And finally, also results from some systematic evaluation research. The idea is if something works in a prevention program, then it must be an explanatory factor for radicalization. All these things we put together and we ended up with this 2-stage model of extremism. We propose that we have, the first step is that we have some ontogenetic developmental processes, and we have, on the one hand, a lot of risk factors, and I will see in detail in a moment, show you in detail in a moment, and on the other side, some protecting factors, some factors who protect people from getting radicalized. And the main hypothesis is that it is important how many risk factors and how many protecting factors people have in their lives. So, and if there is an imbalance of risk and protection, then it comes to, we call it proximal radicalization processes, and we suppose 4 different core processes in radicalization. The first is identity problem, the second is prejudice, the third is ideology, and the fourth is antisocial attitudes and behavior. I will go into the detail what that means in a minute. And if all these 4 processes are deviating from normal developing processes, then the risk for getting radical and extremist is very high. That's the idea of this developmental model. So I go into detail for the first and the second step. What you see here is a long list of risk factors we can derive from biographical and also cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. It's the same situation like in the explanation of crime, like in the explanation of eating disorders, and so on and so on. We have a lot of risk factors. On the society level, for example, real intergroup conflicts. Could you read that in the back? Yes, okay. Real intergroup conflicts or growing social inequality. We know from theories and empirical data that if there is a big social inequality, the risk for getting radicals is higher. But it's only the risk. It's not a determined model. It's only the risk is getting higher. We also have a lot of social risk factors, for example, born in poverty or in family conflicts or parental prejudice against outgroups, no opportunity to positive contact to other outgroups, for example, or the existence of extremistic groups in the neighborhood is a risk factor. And finally, we have also a lot of individual risk factors, starting with some social cognitive processes. They are problematic, for example, especially the deficits in empathy and perspective taking, but also in personality development. A lot of studies show that people have a higher risk if they have a low self-esteem, or even an unrealistic higher self-esteem is also a risk factor, not only a low self-esteem. If they have a high injustice sensitivity, a very interesting research in the last years on this factor, violence affinity, social dominance orientation, these are all psychological personality factors, and if you are high on these factors, the risk for getting radical and extremist is relatively high. Again, it is not that important that every factor must be there. It's more the level of risk. If you have 10 of these risk factors, the risk is higher than you have 3. And it's really independent what kind of risk factors you have. So there are several constructs and several systems of risk factors leading to the same problem, and that means the word of equifinality, which we use in developmental psychology. A lot of different factors leading to the same outcome. So, on the other side, it's not realistic that we have only risk factors, but we have also protecting factors. Protecting factors means that these factors are able to buffer the influence of a risk factor. For example, in general, more intelligent people are better in compensating risk factors. Or if people have in their development a positive emotional relationship, that's a good starting point. Those people can buffer a lot of different risk factors. Of course, in developmental psychology and other developmental sciences, we have much more research on risk factors than on protecting factors. But we are starting at the moment and have also some ideas on extremistic specific factors and processes that buffer from all these risk factors. For example, a high self-control and empathy is a protecting factor for getting extreme. If you understand what people feel when they are discriminated, it buffers you from getting extremist and go into radical groups. If you have non-deviant friends, if you have good school bonding, these are protecting factors. And again, it's not that important which one you have, but the main risk factor is that there is an imbalance between risk and protection from all these factors. And if there is an imbalance, then the probability gets higher to get involved in these next step, namely the proximal radicalization processes. And I mentioned 4. These are necessary conditions to get involved in radicalization and extremism. That's our opinion. From the collection of what we know in science about these pathways. First of all, identity problems. That means it is an unfulfilled need for affiliation, for meaning, or appreciation. That's what Kruglansky called quest for significance. And one risk factor is low self-esteem, and another risk factor for this is a very high self-esteem. We can say the people who has a very low self-esteem and they get involved in extremistic groups, they want to grow up their self-esteem. But we also have people who are maybe the leaders of such groups. They are very narcissistic, they have a high self-esteem, and by the way, also sometimes very high intelligence. So intelligence is not always a protecting factor. Sometimes, in the case of people with very high self-esteem, unrealistic self-esteem, intelligence could be another risk factor because they use their intelligence for their narcissistic motifs. So there are, in other words, we have different constellations of identity problems, but the main point is that there is an unfulfilled need for affiliation. This is one condition we must have for a radicalization. The second is prejudice. That means that we have an exaggerated meaning of identity characteristics like nationality or religion or other things. Maybe also the football club is an idea to put prejudice on, not on your football club, but on others. So it's also prejudice. And with prejudice, we see in most cases also a de-evaluation and inequality of ethnic, national, and religious groups. The other group, that is the core of prejudice. And we need that for radicalization because all radicals and extremists have this kind of characteristic. They have high prejudice. They have always a social group they work against. If they go so far that they say, these people, we have to kill these people, then they need psychologically also an ideology to justify these kind of de-evaluation or inequality. And this starts with simple values or with simple narratives they call in social science. For example, all refugees are looking for German women. That is a narrative in Germany from the right-wing people. Yeah, that's a narrative, an idea. And they are all criminals, for example. This is not a closed ideology, of course, but this is an idea how to explain this inequality. And it goes further, of course, if it becomes worse and worse, that they have really a closed political ideology, like some people in the right-wing area. This is also necessary. Beside identity problems, beside prejudice, it is necessary that they have some kind of ideology to justify inequality. And finally, and this is mostly the first step people go into radicalization pathways, they have to have antisocial attitudes and behavior that is for the legitimation of violence or using of illegal means to change the society and to harm other people. So if all these 4 things are present, the probability to get extreme is very, very high. Sometimes, in some societal condition, it do not lead to extremism because the situation is quite harmonious. Therefore, it is necessary to say that these processes are actually triggered by some society conditions. For example, if there are recent conflicts in the society, so-called refugee crisis or economic crises, or even civil war or something like this, these processes got triggered. They get worse, and we have to think about this. Sometimes if there are no conflicts in a society, we can't imagine that, but it's possible, then maybe these problems do not lead to extremism. But if there are problems, they started with joining radical groups. And groups is a good word. All these processes have something to do with social groups. So I would like to say radicalization and extremism is a group phenomenon. We know of some extremists, like Anders Breivik in Norway, who acting alone, such a lone wolf. But remember that he belongs to the Norwegian society. He wants to save the Norwegian society from foreign influences and so on. So his connection is not individual, his connection is to the Norway society. So it's also a group phenomenon, even if the people are doing action or act alone. Okay. Again, an overview of the whole model. And what is developmental is that we can say that these ontogenetic processes have a lifespan from early childhood, let me say age 5 to age 20. Yeah? That does not mean that you can find some cases where it starts with 4, and you find cases where it already or still working with the age of 25. These proximal radicalization processes, we assume that they work from 10 to 30. So, and I will show you on the next slide where we have some sensitive periods for these 4 proximal processes, these core processes of radicalization. So that is developmental, but we are at the beginning to studying these processes. At what ages could we find some important developments? And this is necessary and even very informative for when should we start with prevention measures. Okay, these are some important sensitive periods. We know, for example, that identity development is a typical question of the early adolescent and late adolescent. Adolescents asking every day themselves, who am I? To which group I want to belong? What is my perspective? So this is a really sensitive period for identity. So if you want to prevent identity problems, then work in this field, in this age group. We know from prejudice research, we have done some research on this, that prejudice starts very early. We can find difference between children at the age of 5, between their attitudes on other social outgroups, for example, on foreigners, let me say, or on refugees or other groups. So there are very early we have differences between children, and we can say that the age around 10, where children start to get very differentiated in their person perception, that some people get stayed in their prejudice and some people get differentiated and their prejudice goes down. So this is a sensitive period, and if you want to prevent prejudice, this age group is maybe the best you can do. We have the same for political ideology. We see that moral and value development is around the age of 10, 12, but political socialization and civic engagement is typical for the age at beginning with 15, 14, and late adolescence and early adulthood. So these ideas gave us some ideas what we can do in preventing radicalization. And I now want to finally show you what we found in radicalization prevention all over the world, let me say. First of all, we can say we found a high number of so-called reviews. That means summarizing articles on what helps in radicalization prevention. One thing we have to learn is that we found more reviews than original studies in this area. So that means a lot of people write about radicalization prevention but not researching this kind of prevention. So we have a very, very few studies at the moment who really tested some models of prevention and look if the basic rate of radicals and extremists are going down with this. So most of the interventions that we found under the label of radicalization prevention are de-radicalization projects. They are working with already radical people. So, and that is not prevention in a narrow sense. Prevention means that they do not go into radical groups, and if you work with radical groups, then it's also important to get them off, of course, but it's not prevention in a narrow sense. So we are looking for models of prevention to get radicalized or to get an extremist. So we are looking at these four processes, at these four fields I described. What can we do, for example, to prevent identity problems? And to our surprise, we found a lot of different programs who are not labeled as radicalization prevention, but they are labeled as prevention of identity problems, or prevention of prejudice, or prevention of antisocial behavior. And we think we can use that, although it's not made for radicalization prevention in specific. So let me go back to this one. We can also do prevention, of course, if we work on all these risk factors or promoting these protecting factors. But you should realize that every single risk factor is only a small piece in that puzzle. And if you are working against societal inequality, it's necessary, it's good, but do not expect that you prevent radicalization in a big amount or with a high effect size, because it's only one small factor for radicalization. And if you work on, let me say here, on the individual level, on some cognitive process like promoting empathy, you can do that. It's okay, but do not expect that you have big effects on radicalization, because it's only one risk factor on several risk factors. If you promote school bounding for pupils, it's okay, it's wonderful. It has several implications. And one implication is that you also work against radicalization, but only to a low extent. And you should not expect that you prevent every radical people. So we are looking not on the single risk factors or the single protecting factors, but we are looking what can we do to prevent these four core processes of radicalization. So, and we found the following. On identity problems, I listed here several programs or several intervention fields, and here you can see all the aims. They want to reach. And here you see some small summary of the results of this. So we have a lot of programs who are working on adventure, on outdoor education or physical activities with young people. And you can say children or adolescents who have a very low self-esteem, they profit from this. They get higher self-esteem. So, and the idea is if they have higher self-esteem, the probability for identity problems is relatively low, and therefore their risk to get involved in radicalization get lower. So that is the idea. And we have some positive outcomes on that. I changed all the statistics to one value, and that means 20% improvement. That's a very rough estimation about what we can expect. And somebody could say 20% improvement is not too much for all these kind of programs. But ask some politician if they get 20% more on elections, what they will say about that. So that is all my argument against politicians who say 20% improvement is not too much. So if they have 20% more elections, they will make big parties for this. Okay, we have some other self-esteem intervention, mostly from the clinical area. And also we can say this hired the self-esteem from people. We have some interesting thing that is a self-affirmation intervention, that's a writing intervention. So especially adolescents have to write on their values. What is important for me? They have simply write it down. And afterwards we can look, or we can see that they have got a higher self-esteem, that they got a better bonding to their values, maybe democratic values. But we have also some problems if they write down some values that we do not want to have, that we do not want to have, that they have it, like prejudice, or Germans are better than all other peoples, could also be a value. So this is maybe also some risky kind of intervention. But if it works, then we have especially effects on resistance to identity threat. If some radical group, for example, say, come to us, we are the solution for all your problems, then they could say, okay, my value is democratic, I'm looking for human rights, so, and your group is not connected to these values, and I don't come. So this is what we found on preventing identity problems. We can do a lot of things in this area, but as I say here, at the moment we have no intervention who are against an unrealistic high self-esteem or for narcissistic people. I mean, narcissism is you can have different opinions on narcissism. Some people say, yeah, if actors or politicians or artists are not narcissistic, they do not produce big art, let me say. Narcissism is a motif that leads to different forms of behavior, but one is that they got leaders of extremistic and radical groups. So we can think about it for preventing from narcissism, but when I discuss this with my American colleagues, they have some other opinion on narcissism. They say that isn't necessary for getting a position in the society. So you can see at this case that's really difficult about the discussion what we should prevent and what not. Is it necessary to prevent narcissism? In the personal contact, narcissistic people are not always very friendly, you can say. But is this a good argument for preventing narcissism? We can say narcissism is a risk factor for it's an identity problem, and it's a risk factor for getting extremism. Okay, the next group is we have much more prevention measures on preventing prejudice. I cannot go because of time constraints in all these models, but let me say one example, and the one example is the intergroup contact interventions. We have a lot of research, hundreds of studies, who show that people from different social group, let me say from Swedish group with refugees, if you bring them into a contact, prejudice goes down. That's a king's way to reduce prejudice. And we have a lot of evidence that this works. So if you want to work against prejudice, bring the people into contact. So this is really clear that this works. We have some other interventions too, let me say here, diversity training or anti-bias training or something like that. These models also work in reducing prejudice, but nothing is better than intergroup contact, believe me. There are so many studies who show that. Of course, you can imagine contact between groups that are negative. Some contacts are negative, of course, contacts are negative. But even if you have no plan and people come together, we can show that it has positive effect on this. One point is, don't bring them into competition. So let me say a football club from Sweden against a refugee football club, because the contact situation must be that they have common goals, that they build friendship, for example. But normally it will work very well. Okay, let me come to the next point, that is political ideologies or strengthening democratic values. We have a big literature on civic education, also in Germany. That's a reaction on the Nazi dictatorship, that we want to build up political interest and political knowledge on young people. So we have a big movement for civic education in schools and outside the schools. And it works. It works quite well, let me say, but we have really very few systematic evaluation studies on this. So it's not really clear if this prevents people from political extremist ideologies. So we have some other intervention, like service learning intervention or character education, they call it. It's mainly in North America and the United States, models of prevention, and they work also quite well. So young people learn to take some responsibility for the society. That is maybe the core of these prevention programs. And finally, I do not want to go into detail again. The prevention of antisocial behavior has a very long tradition in developmental and prevention science, and we know quite well, and my colleague Carl Hill will go into detail tomorrow in his talk. We know very well what we can do against crime and violent crimes. So one problem is to implement all these programs into the regular or social and educational system. That is really one problem, and I'm sure that he will tell about these problems. So the best evaluated concepts in this area are social training programs, parent training programs, and early education. But there are some other promising prevention methods. So, in general, that's the final word. I see that you get nervous for the time. In general, we could say the developmental view on radicalization and extremism is a new and probably useful approach, like it was in the area of violent crimes. We are only at the beginning of the developmental research and theories, and longitudinal research is necessary. It's very expensive and time-consuming. When I start with such a study on the longitudinal development of radicalization, I do not want to have I will not be alive when it ended, this study, so it's very time consuming. And we have now a series of effective prevention measures, not labeled as radicalization prevention, but on several topics in the development of young people. And I would like to say at the final end that prevention on a society level, let me say, solution for political conflicts, especially in the Middle East, for example, is maybe also useful and necessary as these kind of individual forms of prevention. So thank you very much for listening to me so long.